Hello, this is our brief presentation on breast cancer, genetic screening and epigenomics by Cynthia McBride and Dorothy Moore. So there's a revolution going on in genetic testing for breast cancer, lots of new developments, including the emergent use of epigenomics. But we want to emphasize that not everyone is participating equally in this revolution, and that underserved populations do not have the same access to this testing and counseling. And that is why we want to emphasize the importance and difficulty of truly informed consent. Here are just a few brief but important points on genetics and breast cancer. So know that only about 5 to 10% of breast cancers are hereditary. These are mainly caused by mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. If you have a BRCA1 mutation, risks can be as high as 80% of developing breast cancer, but usually only about 55 to 65%. And with the BRCA2 gene mutations, the risk is somewhat lower. People with these gene mutations, genetic mutations, tend to have breast cancers much younger than the general population, and they tend to affect both breasts. And sadly, women with these mutations also are at greatly increased risk for developing ovarian cancer. So we're learning that other genes also play a role. Here's a list of some of them that have been identified. So kind of a newer development is the idea of multi-gene testing panels to kind of give a whole picture of a person's genetic profile. Also relatively new is the idea of epigenetics in terms of breast cancer prediction. Epigenetics, in brief, is the idea that there's these methyl groups hanging off of the DNA that act as switches, kind of like little Christmas lights. And if they're switched on, then they can affect how the DNA expresses certain traits. So they can also switch off things like tumor suppressor genes, and cancer promoting genes can get switched on. And these groups of Christmas tree lights, if you will, are called methylomes. So there's a recent Australian study, just came out a few months ago, that talks about methylation signatures or methylome signatures that may serve as predictive biomarkers for breast cancer. And it also might make it possible for us to have more targeted and effective treatments for breast cancer. This is a really quick overview of who the American Cancer Society says should get genetic testing. And in a nutshell, it's people who have these BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene mutations, or who have strong family histories, in other words, a first-degree relative with the gene mutation, or with cancers, breast cancers at an early age. And then there are also some genetic syndromes listed below that make you more likely to have breast cancer, and thus you should get genetic testing. We want to talk also about the cultural and ethnic considerations, risks associated with breast cancer. Most people probably know that the BRCA mutations are most common in Ashkenazi Jews, but actually they can occur in anyone. And we're finding that in African American women with a family history or early onset or early breast cancers, that those women actually had 16 to 28% of those women actually had these gene mutations. And we're thinking that perhaps people are not being tested as often in these groups, in these population groups. And those, the reasons for this are varied. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the result is this widening gap between black and white women in terms of breast cancer deaths. And this little graphic from the New York Times shows that the gap between black women and white women is getting close to 9% in terms of the lethality of the cancer, breast cancer. Barriers to genetic screening, there's some of them are very practical. If you have a say an hourly kind of blue collar job, it's hard to just take off a couple hours in the middle of the day and go get screened and counseled. There are not as many knowledgeable providers if you're getting your health care, say, through an emergency department or through a public health clinic or some kind of nonprofit. And then it's costly. Even if your insurance is picking up 90%, it still could mean you're $300 out of pocket. There's also a lot of medical mistrust and fear of discrimination around this topic, as borne out by some studies. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more here, about how important it is in terms of informed consent. We have found that African American women are really, at least in one study, we're very concerned about the misuse of genetic information. Asian women had some big knowledge deficits regarding Western medicine, and Hispanic women placed priority on family versus personal health needs, and hence we're very reluctant to take time off to go to the doctor. But helping your clients understand what this testing really means and helping them decipher the statistics can help bring about early detection. I think knowledge is power. I think we all know that. Implications for practice are many, but here are a few of them. As a provider, you should educate yourself on testing options and know what they mean. You should know who's at risk. You should understand what truly informed consent means. And you should know that the underserved are at the greatest risk for not being screened in our country. So to conclude, while we have many new advances in testing, epigenetics is one, the importance of equal access to testing and education for all population groups cannot be overemphasized. And there is this really concerning data on the widening gap between Black and white women vis-a-vis breast cancer deaths. Thank you. And here are some of our references. Thank you.